Um, okay, so I'll just give a really, really brief intro and then hand it over to Pangea. Uh, yeah, this is our second partner event for Black Mammalogists Week, and we're really excited to have Isaac and Elsa, Lola and Antonio tell us a bit more about this project, our potential project. That's a partnership between NASA and a few other collaborators, and really, it sounds like it'll be an opportunity for people who do more wildlife-y type stuff to kind of give their perspective and kind of help inform the development of the project. So really cool opportunity and excited to hear more. And I'll, yeah, hand it over.
Thanks so much, Kendall. Thanks for the opportunity too to the rest of the team for being able to participate in Black Mammalogists Week. We're excited. And I would like to, I'm going to share my slides here, but before we dive in, I want to actually do a round of introductions. And since it's a smaller group, maybe we can actually do a round of intros with everybody. I will describe more what Pangea is in detail, so you'll get plenty of time to hear about that. But I'd love to just orient ourselves to one another in the room first. So I can kick us off and then maybe we can go around. My name's Elsa Ordway. I'm faculty at UCLA in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. And I don't work with mammals. I work with a lot of plants and remote sensing data, primarily in the tropics, but also in California. But I think there's some really exciting opportunities to think about the kinds of research you all do, and how that intersects with the kind of work that some of our Pangea team has expertise in, who's here today. So I am also the PI of Pangea, and I'll talk more about that again in just a few minutes, but I want to go around to our team, and then hopefully if anybody is willing to introduce themselves from the rest of the group, that would be great. So I will pass it off to the next person on my screen, Isaac, and then let's go to Lola and then Antonio.
Sure, thanks, Elsa. Hi, everyone. My name is Isaac Aguilar. I am currently a PhD student at Caltech, but I was the project coordinator for the Pangea Scoping campaign at UCLA before I transitioned to my first year of my PhD. And I'm really interested in using remote sensing as well as stable isotope geochemistry to study the habitat and patterns of mammalian biodiversity. So I'm really excited to be here today.
Thanks. Let's go to Lola next.
Hi everyone, my name is Lola Fatoyunbo and I'm a research scientist at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland. And my expertise is on the ecology of tropical forests and coastal ecosystems like mangroves in particular. And I'm also not a mammologist, but I do have a background in biology as well. And my expertise is really on the remote sensing applications, how to study these ecosystems using satellite imagery or airborne data. And I'm also part of the Pangea team.
Awesome. And let's go to Antonio.
Hi, so my name is Antonio Ferraz. I'm from I'm working with the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory located in Los Angeles, California. My background is also in remote sensing of forest structure, forest carbon, forest biodiversity, forest phenology, and I've been doing this for many years now. At some point, I started interacting a lot with animal ecologists actually. I feel like that's why I'm here today. I mean, there's a big motivation to be here because lately I've been working with animal ecologists that can provide measurements on the ground, for example, about biodiversity to integrate with the maps that we have been doing from airplanes and satellites. So there is a few things that I've been doing. One is working with the folks that do bioacoustics on the ground. So, amphibians and birds, they are way more vocal than mammals. So we have been focusing more on birds and amphibians, but, we have developed a few campaigns in different biomes. And now we are getting to the point on analyzing that integration, like the bioacoustics on the ground with the remote sensing maps we have been doing. And then I'm working in another activity. I'm the project scientist for a project called the Internet of Animals. And on that one, we do work with mammals among many other taxa. But I would say that this project, Internet of Animals, has two big components. One is really focusing on the tech, developing new techniques to for the communication from the Earth surface, from tags that we install in animals, to spaceborne antennas and other devices. So we are working on that tech component to try to improve, the next generation on animal telemetry for animal movement. And the second one maybe is more relevant here because it's in the interface between animal movement and remote sensing. We have an activity called remote sensing for animal movement, where we conduct a lot of interviews with animal ecologists to see what will be like the environmental metrics and climate metrics they would like to have to try to explain the movement of the taxa of interest. So we did a lot of interviews. It was really fun, talked with a lot of animal ecologists. And now we are doing this gap analysis. What are the remote sensing layers that are already available and folks can integrate in their, in their studies of animal movement? What are the data products that can maybe derive with the sensors we already have, but they are not ready yet for users to use? And then there is a third category, which is, eventually, if there is a huge request from the animal ecologists for a new Earth observation, we can eventually, again, propose to NASA or other players to develop the new, for example, a new sensor to observe a new metric that the animal ecology community could be interested. So that's pretty much it. And thank you. Glad being here again.
Awesome. Thanks, Antonio. Are folks up for going around the room to do introductions? That's the representation of our Pangea team here, but I'd love to, hear from other folks in the room briefly before we dive in. Osiris?
Yes, I can start then. Hi, hello everyone. So my name is Osiris. I'm a French Cameroonian, currently based in France. I'm a wildlife biologist, and I've worked quite a lot on the conservation of chimpanzees and giraffes, mainly in Cameroon. I'm now a consultant for a British consultancy, and I support the preservation of chimpanzees living outside protected areas in heavily disturbed land in the Republic of Guinea in West Africa. And I've used camera traps a lot in my work, and I'm just interested in your topic, just curious to see what I can learn from it, just to learn more and use it in my projects. So yeah, I'm very glad to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Mushtaq or Parsa, any interest in introducing yourself? No pressure.
Hi everyone. I'm sorry I'm off camera. My name is Mushtaq. Isaac might know me. I'm part of we did the same summer program at a certain point. I'm here mostly just because I saw the flyer for this project and it looked really interesting. I currently work on the GIS and data science team at American Forest. So, but I mostly work on trees that are in cities. But I do a lot of work with remote sensing data. So I was really curious about this project and I wanted to hear more about it. So I'm here. Nice to meet all of you.
Great to meet you too. Thanks for joining.
Hi, my name is Parsa, and I'm a bachelor student in biology at the University of Tehran. And I'm mostly interested in ecology and evolution, and I'm really thankful to be learning from you guys. Thank you.
Oh, I think you're
I'm muted. Sorry. Thank you all so much for joining us. And I love the international crowd. That is highly relevant to Pangea, as you will see. So let me dive in. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. Okay. Can you see that okay?
Yep.
Great. I'm just going to hide panels and get set up here and then we'll dive in. Okay, so I am really thrilled that Lola and Antonio could join us today too, as you know, members of the Pangea team and also scientists at NASA, two different NASA centers, as they mentioned, NASA Goddard and NASA JPL. There's a lot that NASA does that is, I think, highly relevant to animal ecology. And what I'm going to talk about today is a project that we hope will get selected and will allow for the integration of the kind of work you all do. But that's a piece of many pieces in this bigger project. And so what I'd love to do towards the end is, of course, answer questions that you all have, but hear a little bit more about how you all see what kinds of opportunities you see as arising from Pangea. So what Pangea is it's an effort to scope a possible NASA terrestrial ecology field campaign, and it's focused on the tropics. It's one of two campaigns, which I'll come back to in a moment. So in terms of how we go through today, I want to, after the Pangea presentation, again, I'm happy to answer questions, and I anticipate a lot because it is a large and complex process, but then I really do hope we can get into discussion. If we have a lot of folks, which I think will probably stay a smaller group, we can move into breakouts, but I think, you know, since it is a smaller group, we could probably remain in the large group. Lola and Antonio and Isaac are key members on our Pangea leadership team. We also have a lot of other people who have contributed to the Pangea leadership team, who I want to acknowledge here. And they span not only NASA centers, but also universities, including international universities and the US Forest Service. We also have a huge team of people who are contributing to developing the concept of Pangea. And you'll understand more what that means as I describe it. But these people have dedicated a huge amount of time and volunteering really their time to help move this concept forward. So I want to acknowledge all the work they put into it too. So this concept that you're going to hear about is really the work of many. Stepping back though, what is a NASA terrestrial ecology field campaign? This is directly from a solicitation that came out from NASA last year, and they were putting out a proposal to scope for proposals to scope the next of these, and they want it to answer big science questions focused on a big region. They want it to enable more effective interpretation ultimately of satellite measurements. But they also want this campaign to foster collaborative interactions, build new relationships, train the next generation of scientists, and then ultimately leave a legacy of data that can continue to serve and be valuable well beyond the end of a campaign. And this is building off a really successful history of previous NASA field campaigns. And so the one on the right here is called the Above Campaign, the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment. And that is actually wrapping up and is the reason why NASA's ultimately trying to figure out what will come next, what's going to follow above. And this has been focused on Western Canada and Northern US and Alaska. And it's been focused on trying to understand how we can improve scaling from leaf and ecosystem and flux towers with drones and aircraft ultimately to satellites to understand how these systems are changing and how they're responding to increasing temperatures, increasing permafrost thawing, increasing fire activity. And so really big questions about global change dynamics in this system. And there is a mammal and animal ecology element to that in terms of looking at things like animal movement and changing animal responses to the changes I just described. LBA was prior to Above, that was in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and it's called the Large Scale Biosphere Atmosphere Experiment in Amazonia. It was actually led by Brazil, and NASA got involved in a component of it called LBA Eco. And that was an opportunity for a lot of scientists, not so much animal ecologists, more scientists like atmospheric chemists and hydrologists and meteorologists and forest ecologists to come together to understand how the system functions as an entity in the Amazon. I do think we actually had a seminar for grad students at UCLA last year, and we reviewed LBA and on other previous campaigns and kind of looked at what were the successes and what was lacking. And what was lacking was the animal component, one of a handful of things. In spite of that, it was a huge success, particularly in terms of the amount of training it resulted in. So it trained an entire cohort of graduate students. Over 1,000 graduate students went through the LBA program or LBA project. And about half of those were master's and PhD students from Brazil. So this was a really, really valuable opportunity to kind of raise a generation of experts through a campaign like this. And the scaling element and that training element are really big parts of what we're proposing with Pangea. In terms of process, so Pangea is one of 2 proposals that got funded to scope this year. So ARID is another one focused on dryland systems. And frankly, I'd encourage you to check out both. Pangea and ARID could both be easily Googled online, and I'll share a link to our website at the end. But this is really a once in a decade opportunity to engage in an effort to guide future funding opportunities. And for those folks who are soon to be PIs, or, even if you're just starting grad school and you don't anticipate having access to kind of writing your own proposals until 5 years from now, that's still within the timeline of these campaigns. These will really not start before about 2026, and then they'll be about 6 to 9 years out from that. So these are long-term efforts, and it's a really cool and unique opportunity to get involved early in the process. So we've been spending this year working with the research community, but I'll also talk about other communities that we've been engaging to identify the different scientific research priorities and opportunities, start to build relationships in the hopes that this does get selected to define what the shared goals would be, and then really ultimately evaluate what's feasible within the scope of a campaign like this. We have a draft white paper that's coming out today, and I can share that with Kendall so he can share it with the email list. That is going to be out for a public comment period. It's a draft and will ultimately incorporate feedback and comments and submit a final version December 6th to NASA headquarters. And that white paper outlines the details of what this campaign could look like. If it gets selected, which would be early next year at the likeliest, it would fund a 6 to 9 year campaign. And again, the earliest that would start realistically would be about 2026. So this is a marathon of an effort. Why are we focused on tropical systems? Because tropical ecosystems are globally really, really important. I'm guessing most of you know about the diversity. They're home to about 2/3 of the planet's species. But despite covering less than 10% of the ice-free land surface, they're also really important for a lot of other reasons. They're home to about 3 billion people who directly and indirectly depend on these systems. They constitute really huge major heat and water pumps, which ultimately means they're contributing to both local and regional and global climate systems. They're also really important for the carbon cycle, accounting for about 30% of terrestrial net primary productivity and storing a huge amount of above ground and below ground carbon stocks. They're also changing really rapidly. So on the left here, you're going to see Landsat satellite imagery showing deforestation patterns in Rondônia, Brazil. And on the right, you're seeing VIIRS active fire information for the year just of 2020. And fires, land use change, droughts, all of these kinds of changing dynamics as a result of both climate change and human impacts are pushing tropical ecosystems towards a no analog state where they're going to be ultimately compositionally different than anything found today. And that's going to really diminish tropical forest function by the end of the century, resulting in really critical feedbacks for animals, for the plants, for people in these systems, and also for people like us far away. If you're from Cameroon, it'll affect you obviously a lot more directly than somebody sitting in the US or Iran. But nonetheless, these systems are going to shift in ways that will have both local, regional, and global impacts. We're particularly focused on the carbon cycle, but I'll come back to how that influences and interacts with mammals. the reason we care about the carbon cycle is because the land, and I'm zooming out globally now, the land is a really important carbon sink, but the future of that sink is really uncertain. So this is a bunch of Earth system models that are projecting the land flux out to the end of the century, and they're completely in disagreement about whether they predict the system's going to store carbon or emit carbon. And other work has shown that most of that variability in output is concentrated in the tropics. So there's about 3 times greater variability in model output in the tropics than other latitudes, indicating that that's a big source of uncertainty. Other more recent work has pushed to constrain that, but there's still so many questions about the processes that we're missing in these models and how to capture the huge amount of diversity in these systems. We're also seeing responses to extreme events in terms of the carbon cycle dynamics. So in response to the El Nino in 2015, all of these systems, which are typically a carbon sink, flipped to becoming sources of carbon to the atmosphere, but for really different reasons. In the Americas, it was a result of drier land surface and less plant growth, and that led to more CO2 emissions. In Africa, it was higher temperatures and increased respiration. And in Asia, it was a hotter, drier land surface and more fire that led to more CO2 emissions. So Pangea is really focused on understanding the vulnerability and resilience of these tropical forest landscapes in terms of thinking about the implications of the carbon cycle and climate perturbations. And critically, there's a lot that gets packed into these carbon cycle dynamics. So if we think about 2 continents like South America and Africa, which were conjoined millions of years ago, they've followed very different evolutionary trajectories, very different climatic conditions. They've been exposed to very different climatic conditions. They have very different human interactions and long histories of people in these landscapes that have influenced these systems in ways that are likely underpinning very different responses to the really rapid change we're seeing now, in ways that probably is going to influence potential different trajectories into the future. And so Pangea is really focused on, again, taking this NASA terrestrial ecology scaling approach to understand how different tropical forests will respond differently to climate change, recognizing that we need to go beyond treating these systems as a single monolith and unpack the heterogeneity and diversity of these systems to better understand these different responses. So Pangea's objectives are to characterize and quantify this heterogeneity in tropical forest responses to change, both climate change and land use change. The goal is also to constrain model uncertainty of future tropical carbon flux predictions. And this is incorporating process and improvement in process understanding and advancing remote sensing data model integration. Animals play a big role, potentially, we think, in these differences in carbon dynamics. For example, the role of large megafauna like elephants. They're present in Africa and not in the Amazon, and could be contributing to potential resiliency in African tropical forests that we're seeing. But there's huge question marks about those processes. And then there's still major limitations to incorporating the animal interactions in models. So there's a lot of work to be done with respect to mammal movement, behavior, plant-animal interactions. And ultimately, because this is really focused on improving our ability to use satellite data sets, a big goal of Pangea is to address calibration and validation needs, which is NASA speak for making sure we can use the satellite data effectively and accurately. You have to coordinate, calibrate that, and validate it with ground data often. And then supporting algorithm development so that once we know we do have well-calibrated and validated measurements from satellites, we can use that to derive products that are actually of interest. So for example, JEDI, the Global Ecosystem Dynamics Investigation, gives us spaceborne LiDAR. The LiDAR isn't what you all will use. You'll want to use some sort of product that informs you about canopy height or gappiness, because that might influence animal movement or where species nest or forage or mate. So the products are also really important, and Antonio was alluding to that a little bit too in his introduction. So Pangea is big. We're focusing on a lot of different elements, recognizing that the integrated nature of these different aspects of tropical forests are really important to piece together to understand how they're responding to change. So we're parsing those differences into biogeochemical cycle dynamics, social ecological systems, biodiversity, and climate feedbacks and interactions. And then we've got cross-cutting themes related to modeling and data synthesis and community engagement and feasibility. We're also really interested in the applications of this research. So there's a real potential for a big effort like this that spans roughly 10 years to result in some pretty big scientific advances, both in terms of understanding, but also in terms of data products. And we think that it's really important to be thinking about the potential use of those products at the outset so that that can be a joint effort to start to develop those products with the action-oriented output in mind. And so some themes of what Pangea is focusing on is mitigation of climate change, carbon sequestration permanence, management related to sustainable agriculture, conservation related to biodiversity conservation and restoration, and adaptation, something we've spent a lot of time doing workshops in different parts of the tropics, and a lot of people are very interested in these sorts of remote sensing products for disaster alert and response improvements. Pangea is well timed because we now have a whole suite of satellite data now and forthcoming. I think in the next few years, we're going to have a lot more as well. That's really allowing us to understand these incredibly diverse systems in a whole new way. So for a long time, we've used satellite data to capture differences in greenness. So some of you may know of NDVI, the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, which characterizes differences in greenness and has been used as a proxy for productivity. And in a lot of research in animal ecology, that's kind of the go-to product that's used. But we now have satellites that can go well beyond that and go from greenness to characterizing functional diversity of forest types, for example, in this Malaysian Borneo landscape. And these satellites like JEDI, I mentioned, that can measure structure, or hyperspectral data that can characterize different kind of levels of plant diversity related to function and functional traits are important. Thinking about water movement in the system, SWAT, the surface water measurements. A new sensor called NISAR is a radar sensor that's going to get at similar to JEDI, but in subtly different ways, kind of the structure and biomass of these systems. And then there's other satellites that are newly available to us that are allowing us to more directly get at these fluxes of carbon from the system. So we're in this whole new era of satellite remote sensing where we can go beyond these metrics of greenness. And I think, you know, one of my concerns is that it's going to take like another decade before other communities in ecology kind of get on board with using these really, really valuable data sets. I see a lot of people still using NDVI for a lot of things, which can be useful, but there's so many more tools in our toolbox now. And I think thinking about what metrics are most useful and important for understanding processes and systems is the place to start as we kind of go into this next era of remote sensing, rather than just trying to do what is easiest because it's what we know how to do. Let's reimagine what kinds of products and metrics we can explore deriving based on what we think we need to improve understanding of these systems. And there has been work, so Antonio alluded to this too, of integrating information that we can't get from satellite data sets to try to better understand what could we proxy. So satellite remote sensing is in a lot of ways direct measurements of certain phenomena, like leaves in the tops of canopies, or aerosols in the atmosphere, or CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. But we're not going to get direct measurements of fish in the water, or a deer or something moving under a canopy. What we can do, though, is integrate other types of data sets like camera trap data, bioacoustics data, telemetry movement data, with these kinds of spatially explicit satellite-derived products. And again, I think this is a really exciting space that's just starting to explode with new ideas and opportunities, especially given new computing capabilities as well. And so I think it's a really important time for folks in the animal ecology space to really engage and be a part of the conversation about how to move this forward. This is an interesting example from Cameroon, actually. So I actually do a lot of research in Cameroon. This is in the Dja Forest Reserve in southern Cameroon, working with a lot of partners from local communities through the Congo Basin Institute. And this is actually a NASA biodiversity funded project. And Tony is a collaborator on this, as are many, many, many other people, looking at really important seed dispersing taxa. So different fruit bat species, a couple of bird species like the turaco and hornbill, a couple of duiker species, ungulates, and the gray-cheeked mangabey, to understand how their movement and nesting patterns influences or is linked to forest structure and function. And there's so much more work to be done in this kind of same kind of vein. So coming back to Pangea, what we ultimately hope to do is take data sets like that and many, many, many other data sets to scale understanding from the organismal level all the way up to the satellite scale. So we are really talking about landscape scale research, where there would be kind of a network of sites nested within a landscape that span intact systems, agroecosystems, degraded systems, to understand that variation, and then have multiple landscapes where we can compare across systems in Africa and the Americas, tropical Africa and tropical Americas. So the core domain of Pangea is just that. We are going to prioritize, if selected, landscapes in Africa and the Americas, and then satellite remote sensing and modeling capabilities would allow us to extend research to the broader pantropics, including Asia and parts of Australia as well. And it's really, really important to emphasize that there's a lot of work already going on in these places, and there's a huge network of folks we've been engaging with throughout the Pangea process to really work to make sure that Pangea is not redundant or duplicative, but rather it fills in important gaps that still need filling, which importantly are these calibration and validation and process-based understanding gaps, so that we can more effectively use satellite data in the tropics, where right now it's really challenging to do that. So there's many partners listed here who have provided a lot of input and are actively engaged in developing the Pangea concept as well. Part of the process has actually been to go to a lot of different parts of the tropics, as well as places in the US and Europe, like Washington, DC, to have big meetings so that we can workshop this idea further. And in addition to that, we've been really working hard to try to engage community members that extend beyond the traditional scientific community, including Indigenous and local community representation. So when we're thinking about a pan-tropical campaign, or even a campaign in Africa and the Americas, that's potentially many, many communities. One of the ways we've approached that engagement is through alliance organizations like the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, the GATC, who is, it's an organization, it truly is an alliance of many Indigenous leaders that represent many Indigenous communities across the tropics. And they've been working for 10 years to really empower their communities and give voice to greater engagement in science and in policy around everything from biodiversity to carbon markets to territorial mapping. So there's a really exciting opportunity, we think, for Pangea to kind of shift the way we do science as well through this kind of engagement at the outset. So to wrap up, the 3 pillars of Pangea are focused on advancing this scientific understanding, but also to really train the next generation of scientists, and in particular focusing on training scientists and community leaders and members from these countries to be able to lead these efforts moving forward. And then third, really again, thinking about the monitoring capabilities and action related to biodiversity conservation and climate mitigation. We think there's an opportunity that will emerge from Pangea that we need to be thinking about at the outset. So with that, here's the QR code, and there is a tiny URL to our website. You're also welcome to contact me if you have questions, but hopefully, let me go back here. We've got plenty of time to actually dive into a bit of a conversation. And I think it would be great to just stay in this same room. I have some questions here that could prompt discussion, but before we get into that, maybe I'll stay on this slide and answer any questions about what you just heard about. And then if we want some prompts for discussion, we can move on to the next slide, or we can just take it from there. But thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. That was great. I have a little question about what has been done so far in some of the data integration stuff. I don't know if this goes into the discussion part, but yeah, I think something would be super relevant for a lot of wildlife ecologists is kind of the scalability of like the kind of like the on the ground data that we're collecting with like a handful of camera traps or acoustic monitors, and that the effectiveness of like that being integrated into like this more landscape scale thing. Have there been examples already in the works for that, or yeah, just like general kind of ideas of how to do that?
It's a good question. Antonio, do you have thoughts? I do, but if you want to take it first, I'm guessing you do. You're muted.
Sorry, can you repeat that, Kendall? Because it was cutting a little bit of sound on this side.
Yeah, I just asked kind of about the scalability of taking like a lot of, I guess, wildlife biologists are taking kind of presence absence data of species at just like maybe a subset of the full landscape, and just because I'm generally curious about if there are examples underneath Pangea or like examples that you're kind of using that will be integrated into it to really like scale up the information that we're able to get at really fine scales to draw inference on like these landscape level scales that also was talking about.
Yeah, no, this is a good question because that has been a problem of integrating biology on the ground with remote sensing because the scales, they didn't match, right? Usually these field studies, they are in small sites as we were describing, and in remote sensing, you do large scale. So what's like a very trendy, I will say, field of research is to using these, what we call the emergent technologies. That includes the bioacoustics, the camera traps, and the tags for animal movement. So these are really tools that we can go from like, field sites to landscapes. So that really helps to scale up a lot. So when this is like, people are just now touching to these things. So this is a emergent area of research. And there is also another thing that is helping a lot scaling up, which is the citizen science. So now everybody has phones, they collect images, they upload it to database like eBirds that is really popular in the US. There is others across the world. So that also helps a lot, the citizen science. There is problems with that. There is bias because, we are sampling way more, for example, around cities that we are in the wild and all that. But, those are also tools that we can use for scaling up these things. And then I had another thought that I forgot, but if I recall it, I will get back to you. Does that address your question?
Yeah, and just generally curious. I think it's an issue that wildlife ecologists deal with all the time. So just like wondering kind of the steps you all are taking to, it sounds like there could be support for that potentially through
Yes.
this.
So I was just sad that we are doing some experiments because it's also, even with these emerging technologies like camera traps, bioacoustics, it's really tough for us to link it to measurements we are taking from space, because now from space is like, let's say 30-meter resolution, and a camera trap or a bioacoustic sensor on the ground is representative of a much smaller area. So we are also really looking into these methods that they use, for example, drones, and they're airborne, and then to connect with the space. So there is like this, and Pangea focus a lot on that actually. How to go from leaves to crowns to landscapes, and then to from field sites and then landscapes. So there is a lot of research there, and like the animal ecology on the ground is a part of it.
That's kind of building off that was what I was going to respond with is that scaling approach. I think that's an interesting analogy to start from, but to my knowledge, it just hasn't been as deeply kind of methodologically explored as with, say, plants. So as an example, we've got this hyperspectral data that allows us to see from the visible to the shortwave infrared and these really fine scales, and you can draw what are called these spectral signatures that actually allow us to partition foliar traits, leaf traits that are important for understanding growth strategies, similar to animal traits in some ways. But they're specifically linked to the biophysical chemical compounds in that leaf. There's a kind of a fundamental physical relationship. And so the way we scale that from an individual leaf to in most cases an aircraft data set, as opposed to a satellite data set, we're just kind of moving into that frontier now. In the case of these leaf traits, we go out and we take a bunch of leaves from the top of the crown of a tree that we know is visible in that imagery. And right, it's not shaded and there's no clouds. And we take those leaves back and we process the traits. And we delineate that crown so that we can link the pixels in that imagery to that tree and then develop a modeled relationship to scale that. But it's in a lot of ways going to be really different with animals. And the kind of data we have is not going to be stationary and you can't delineate it to one tree, right? These animals are moving. So the GPS tags from telemetry data is really valuable. Bioacoustics and camera traps can be information that's useful for presence, but not absence. There's a lot of work to be done on the scaling methods themselves that you're hinting at. So there are some examples that are out there. And one way is Meg Crowfoot, who's at Max Planck, does a lot of work on animal nutrient landscapes. So kind of thinking about like, what can we get from remote sensing data and how might that link to things that are of interest to mammals or animals more broadly. And she does a lot of primate work. And so she is thinking about nutrient landscapes in terms of that as an indicator of food availability for animals. So we can sense these traits. How might that link to the presence of different kinds of access to food availability in different seasons and different places in space and time? And so I think it's in some ways about like the methods of data collection or the methods of analysis. But I think also it's about process understanding. What is it that we should expect to be able to see in remote sensing that's important or relevant to how animals use space in ways that are detectable?
If I could also add an example of a project that I got some experience with, like combining in situ like survey data with like remote sensing data sets, was when I participated in a field course on the island of Moorea in French Polynesia. I did like avifaunal bird count surveys throughout the forest, and I identified like patches of like somewhat homogeneous forest like composition, looking at like the taxa and the structure. And then I kind of use the presence absence data of the birds that I found in that section to inform a habitat suitability model that was using a like highly classified like vegetation raster of the entire island to kind of look at areas that could be suitable habitat for a endemic bird that was a threatened species. So that might be a little bit like more simple, but like it was one way that I kind of got introduced to how to leverage like the lines of evidence from both like in situ surveys and like the like high throughput data from remote sensing classification type of models.
Yeah, let's just start like to build on the Isaac and Elsa's comment. You know, this modeling aspect is really in the early stages. So Elsa was alluding to this, modeling that focus in the processes, like animals going after the nutrients, for example. It's like one process that we need to learn. But there is another aspect of the modeling, which is, I mean, we can frame it like, like the species distribution models that people do a lot using remote sensing. And they are a little more advanced, that are these models that focus on processes. But still, I think that the data sets we are acquiring with Pangea can help a lot to come up with more, more effective or more accurate species distribution models. So I think this species distribution models is like the modeling aspect that is more advanced in the integration of remote sensing and animal ecology. But I think we all agree that the most interesting part is on understanding the processes as well, and there is a lot of work to do there. And hopefully, Pangea will help that in the tropical regions.
I want to come to a question that Mushtaq put in the chat, which is a really good one, about capturing urban areas or kind of these non-intact, I'll call them, areas where there's more people in the landscape. And I'm going to parse that out and how we're thinking about it, and then I'll come back to urban areas, because urban areas are very softly kind of incorporated. So we're taking this nested approach for the very explicit reason of wanting to scale. We want to be able to capture gradients, and we want to capture gradients across diversity, climatic conditions, disturbance, human activity and engagement. And so a landscape would be, say, a landscape in Cameroon where there would be multiple field sites that would span an agricultural system, an intact forest, a village area, maybe a city. And that could all be captured from an aircraft within one flight. Lola, I'm going to come to you in a few minutes to talk about the AfroSAR campaign, if that's okay, just to provide some context on these kinds of campaigns. But so then these flight campaigns allow for capturing these large, what we call kind of flight transects, or these mosaic wall-to-wall areas where you do a lawnmower pattern with a plane. And so with a transect or with that mosaic approach, you can capture a lot of information in a single flight. And the idea would be to coordinate ground data collection within a gradient that is underneath that airborne data that's also coincident with the satellite data. And that's what allows for that scaling approach. But yeah, we very much do want gradients. Urban areas may or may not be included. There's a lot of elements of uncertainty still, so that will be defined if this gets selected. So if it gets selected next year, there would be about a 1 year process, 1 or 2 year process, where we would develop what's called the concise experimental plan, because it would be at the point of selection that NASA really tells us, here's how much money you have for this. We have a general idea, but they don't even know yet because budgets are so in flux these days. And so it's once that selection is made and funding is announced that we can really in earnest plan. And that's going to inform how many landscapes we can collect data in, and working with partners is going to inform what are priorities within those landscapes, and working with the modeling community is going to inform what are the variability or the gradients we need to capture, and the field community as well. I think urban systems it's been really interesting to me. It hasn't come up as much in Pangea as, say, this kind of more traditionally defined disturbance gradient from like intact forest systems to non-intact forest systems. But I think that we do have a whole social ecological systems component that recognizes the flows between these systems are going to be really important to a lot of the science questions. And I think that the degree to which we can include urban systems is going to kind of depend on the flight campaigns themselves. So I want to actually now pivot to hearing from Lola. Lola is one of the leads of a recent campaign called AfroSAR 2. It builds on AfroSAR 1, which happened in Gabon in 2016. And this year they flew many, many more countries across Central and West Africa. And I think it's valuable just to kind of get some insight into how NASA carries out these campaigns too. So Lola, maybe you can tell the folks a little bit about what a campaign like that encompasses and how it plays out and what the outcomes are, and also kind of what the relationships are that are in a big part of that with on the ground institutions that inform where and when and how you can even fly.
Okay, yeah, sure. So as Elsa mentioned, I was the PI, so kind of the main coordinator for these 2 campaigns that happened in 2016 and then 2023 and 2024. And essentially what this means is that we had two NASA instruments that were demonstration instruments for future satellite missions that were flying to, in this case, we were flying to Gabon, and we had, it was originally a, what we call a calibration validation campaign. So essentially collecting airborne data, which would be very high accuracy, higher resolution, essentially quote unquote better data than what we would get from the satellite, to use that data to compare what we get from those measurements to what we would be getting from satellite missions in the future. And so oftentimes these types of measurements are really used to develop the algorithms that we might use to analyze this data. So for AFRISAR, we flew with a LiDAR instrument and a radar instrument. And these were two instruments, and the main focus here was to look at tropical forest structure and develop the methodologies for applying radar and LiDAR data to tropical forests to estimate biomass stocks and carbon stocks, and also eventually look at how can we use this data to assess, forest health or other types of measurements. And there were some biodiversity questions involved as well, like how do we use this type of data to map or to model like forest biodiversity, and there's some examples here. And I guess what's really important to note in these, when we do these campaigns, is that there's a whole aspect of actually the instrument side, getting the instrument ready, getting the planes organized, which is a whole big thing, because you actually have to make sure that there is a plane that is appropriate for your instrument. You have to make sure that the plane is available when you want to fly. When you're working with an airborne mission, you don't have, constant acquisition of data. You actually have to fly during, you can, it's beneficial because you can decide during which season you would want to collect data. So you can essentially, get the right timing, but you also have to, there's a whole coordination effort there where you have to make sure that all of the kind of logistical, technical side all aligns. And then there's also a really important component, which is the partnerships, right? Working with the right partners, because as Elsa, I think, explained, we like to go from field to airborne to spaceborne, right? So that we have 3 levels of measurements, which allows us to build, the best relationships and the best models and do the most accurate analysis that we can. And in order to do that, we really need that relationship with people who are already working on the ground, who are in the field, who are collecting data, who know the sites, who know which areas are the most important, and where, field measurements already exist. So in this case, we were working in Gabon. There were several long-term plot networks that had been working there. So there were many field sites that had already been measured several times, which were an ongoing experiments. And so this was really an ideal spot to do this type of campaign. And so we flew in 2016. We collected, I want to say probably 60-hour flight hours worth of data, and which is quite a bit. This was the first, I think, one of the first missions to, definitely the first mission to Central Africa, but one of NASA's first airborne missions to Africa in general. And we had a really strong collaboration there with the Gabonese Space Agency and with the Gabonese National Parks Agency. And that's really what made this campaign, I think, so successful, is that because we had such a strong collaboration with the National Park Agency and the Space Agency, this really allowed us to tailor our sites to areas that were really of national importance. And so, for this follow-on campaign that we then had this year and last year, really this was in order to be able to look at changes that have been happening and also to expand into other regions. So as Elsa mentioned, we worked in we were able to acquire data in several African countries, including the Republic of Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Cameroon, and Ghana. And so this is really, really important for us that this was successful, because it highlights that we do know how to do that whole pre-coordination portion that I mentioned earlier that would allow us to have successful airborne campaigns like this. That work?
Yeah, that was awesome. I think it's really helpful to give people insight into how much work goes into these kinds of campaigns and how important it is to build those relationships on the ground. And I think, coming back to Mushtaq's question about urban systems, that, like there's a lot of, you can only imagine, right, how much Lola and her team were having to coordinate not only with collaborators who know about these ecosystems on the ground, but then also flight permissions over urban areas and things like that. So all of that gets taken into account as these campaigns get underway.
And one thing that I guess I'll add here is that, for example, we did end up collecting, even though Libreville, Gabon is not one of our main sites, we did end up collecting some data over Libreville. And so oftentimes, or sometimes there are these targets of opportunity or piggyback opportunities where you might be, if you're interested in specific areas, there might be ways to extend flight lines or to kind of, shift your data acquisition so that it also flies over a specific area, for example. So I think what's really important often is the availability of existing field data or existing relationships and research, and that often is a really effective way of providing kind of justification as to why certain sites should be collected.
Thanks. There's a couple of questions in the chat too that I want to come to. So one is I'm going to go with Mushtaq's second question just really quickly to Antonio and then come back to Parsa, because I think Parsa's question is an interesting one and we can go in a lot of different directions with that. But kind of related to staying up to date on those kinds of piggyback opportunities. If Pangaea gets selected, I'd say keep an eye on our website and ARIDS as well. There will be an announcement of one next year, maybe both, we don't know. And so just stay in the loop about what opportunities might arise from either one of those campaigns, because I'm sure many opportunities will emerge. Specifically on the scaling methods, Antonio, can you talk about any ways that people could stay in touch or stay up to speed on the kinds of methods you were talking about in terms of using bioacoustics data, camera trap data, things like that with remote sensing data based on some of the groups you're involved with?
Yes, so this is a good question because, historically, until recently, this has been two different communities, people doing measurements on the ground on, animal ecologists and remote sensing. So there is no, and there is a few venues, and I can put it in the chat next, to interact a lot with people from these emerging technologies that really help, as I was saying, to scale up things, because, we can install a bioacoustic recorder for days and days in a row, same thing for the camera traps. So there is some forums and, a few associations and organizations that they do regular meetings to keep the community updated. I'm thinking, for example, in the Wild Labs community, probably you guys know that one, which is an NGO out from the UK. They organize these 2 monthly meetings where they bring people working on these emerging technologies. So it's basically animal movement, camera traps, bioacoustics, even eDNA, and other more exoteric stuff that I don't understand. But those are great venues to interact with this community that are working on the emergent technologies. So there is also some folks that go there and present. So what happens there is that they have like these seminars where they, invite, like, for example, 5 people to talk about their work. So, and they have like a forum, they have a great website. You can put your own question. You you can, open your profile on that web page, and then, a lot of discussion started there. Just an example, my biodiversity projects that I have started there in that venue. I went there to the Slack channel and asked who is interested in working in bioacoustics. One guy that I didn't know replied to me, and we start working on this thing together. That to say that, there is some venues that I can put in the chat where people from the, in situ measurements, they talk with each other. There is other venues where our community, the remote sensing, are talking to each other, and, we can also point to those, but there is no a single venue where that facilitates these two communities coming together. Once in a while, there is activities where they talk about the integration of both communities, but there is, and there is a lot, and there is, way more, that's an increasing field, but I cannot now remember a way of work, on like a community that keeps you updated about these activities. What, of course, that is out there is, a lot of conferences, a lot of journals, there is special issues, there is research papers out there that talk about these integration. There is a few journals that they publish more on that than others, but I don't know else if you have any idea for like a specific journal or a specific conference. I mean, conference, there is a lot, but usually these conferences, they are expensive to go oftentimes. And, first they are expensive, and usually they are not open to the public. We need to go, we need to register, registration is maybe $1,000, and then there is all the expenses with traveling and so on. So that is kind of, more difficult, but there is a few journal papers that we can point at that talk about this integration.
Yeah, I put a few links in the chat. So there's actually a conference next year that's the first of its kind called Biospace, Biodiversity Insight from Space. And it's the main organizer is the European Space Agency, actually. So it's in Italy, if you're interested in going in early 2025. But this truly is a frontier space, and there just aren't a lot of, as Antonio said, there's these kind of one-off projects or smaller groups, but there aren't huge networks yet of people who are working at the interface of this stuff. But there's a handful of people who are kind of leading some of the work. So I would encourage you to check out Meg Crowfoot's work. She's doing some really interesting work. There's also the Map of Life effort, which I put a link to that too, which is actively kind of creating some of these different biodiversity variables, mappable biodiversity variables. So that's one of the bigger initiatives. And then NEON, for those who are familiar, the National Ecological Observatory Network in the United States has a really cool remote sensing setup that has airborne LiDAR and hyperspectral data that also flies over these areas where there's a ton of ground data collection. So they care a lot about how we can use those kinds of data. And they're also really great at putting out tutorials and doing kind of workshops. So they have a tutorial that they did recently for scaling. And I have a feeling, I haven't watched it, but I have a feeling, knowing the people who did it, it's probably more plant biodiversity based, but it still is oriented around these kinds of scaling principles. And that was with the Ceres lab out of Boulder. So I highly recommend checking that out just to get some of the kind of principles of scaling, because I think my suggestion is that there's a lot of room for expansion based on taking some of those principles of scaling in terms of the methods, but then thinking about the processes that matter to you all. And then we all need to kind of figure out where those intersect. Any other thoughts from Lola or Isaac before we go on to the next question from Parsa?
So one thing that I will add is that, there is a huge interest, of course, in this scaling problem from NASA, because we do spaceborne stuff, and there is last year, and I think now they are reviewing that. They call for proposals just focusing on that. How do we scale from fields to satellites? It's a big program, so people, they can write their proposals. This 15 pages proposal, it was really competitive. And that includes not only animals, includes, plants, and different types of plants and different types of biomes. But it's like a really, really hot question, I would say. It's really interesting for us, people interested in working in these scaling problems. And of course, these emerging technologies, they help a lot.
Good segue. So going to Parsa's question, I'd be curious actually to start with Isaac on this one, because you're really at the frontier and you've been exposed to so much in the context of Pangea and all the different kinds of possibilities that are out there, and your fresh eyes on it, I think will have a nice new take on it. But the question, and then I want to go to Lola and Antonio too, and I have thoughts as well, but what do you think are the exciting new technologies and data sets that have the perspective to really kind of push what we do over the next decade?
Yeah, sure. So I think one thing that I've really been thinking a lot about is data sets of essential biodiversity variables that are observable from space. And so that can mean whether it's like the richness of a species, or if it's the presence or absence of a species in a certain area, or other types of variables that can kind of connect back to like mammal diversity or back to vertebrate diversity on the landscape, and those contributions to the structure and function and resilience of the forest that they live in. I think that's the kind of context of those EBVs, essential biodiversity variables, that I've been like thinking a lot about and how to leverage other methods with like technological computing for high dimensional data or high throughput data from the spectral diversity of a landscape. Is I think a very exciting kind of frontier, and how we can think about these types of questions about the patterns and processes of biodiversity across the landscape.
Awesome. Lola or Antonio, do you have any thoughts?
I think for me, to be honest, like I couldn't tell you a single measurement that think is going to be the most amazing and groundbreaking. But what I'm really excited about is the fact that we now have so many different measurements that can be combined. And I think that's been, it's already happening now. And I feel like it's really revolutionized the types of questions that we can ask and, analysis that we can do, because we can actually combine so many different data sets, starting from the field data to satellite data, whether we have, hyperspectral or SAR or LiDAR data. When I first started working in this, when you came in, you would be an expert in one type of data. So you were like either a SAR expert, or you were a LiDAR person, or you were an optical person, started like passive optical, or you were maybe an ecologist. You couldn't do all of it together, right? You would be like, you would be in a box, and now we have so many different data sets. Just using one doesn't make any sense anymore. And I find that the most exciting, kind of not really interdisciplinary, but the compounding maybe strength of so many data sets.
Yeah, I agree with that, Lola. I think we have been doing a lot of single sensor science and habitat characterization through single sensor. Now it's time to bring all those together to do, like an holistic vision of, forest structure, forest function, forest composition, forest phenology. We need to bring all these pieces together. But addressing more directly the question as well, I'm quite excited about what we can get from imaging spectroscopy, because as Elsa was saying, we have been seeing these tropical forests like a green carpet. That's basically what we see from NDVI, like these different grays, different levels of green. And I'm not an expert in imaging spectroscopy, but I'm really excited to see what we can get out from these measurements in terms of, for example, nutrients. What are the foliar traits that are available across space and time, and that animals, they depend on that, right? We have a door to map like the resources availability, the food for an animal, for example, where are the sugars, and when are they, popping up in the landscape. This is quite interesting, going from like this greenness that we have been doing with the tools we have now towards, doing nutrients and flowering, fruiting. I mean, there is a lot of things to explore there. So I think together with the structure, together with the, other things, I think these new dimensions that the imaging spectroscopy will open, it will be really exciting for both plant and animal science and applications.
Yeah, I agree with all. I think the last thing I'll add is just, I think what's exciting to me, because of exactly what Lolo is describing, the data fusion, kind of working across these sensors, is being able to start to use satellite remote sensing, not just for mapping variables or metrics, but for mapping processes. I think we're still a ways from that, but I think we're getting closer. And I think it's going to be a really exciting time to think about, like, how do we shift our thinking to move away from thinking in variable space into thinking process space. So, and I think we're getting there with the kind of the fusion of sensors and also the computing capabilities, but we'll see. I'm excited to see where it all goes. If there aren't, do we have more questions? Yeah, if there aren't any more questions, I just want to thank you all for taking the time to join us. It's been really fun to talk with you all. I hope you've gotten something out of it. And Kendall, please do share the video with the broader group too. We want more and more and more folks to engage with the remote sensing community on these kinds of topics. We think there's a lot of potential. We hope you do too. But yeah, any last questions before we wrap it up? Yeah.
Yes. Maybe just one regarding the gray cheek mangabees, because you said that some of these monkeys were followed. And do you have like maybe a paper, some sources to know to share the size of their territory, because it's a species I like a lot. So and there hasn't been that many studies on them. So yeah. Is there a new way to see this data or something?
Yeah, good question. We're in the process, and I am not leading that paper. Nick Russo, who's a graduate student here, has been working. So it's actually Meg Crowfoot had a tech who went out and collected the data and as a part of this project. And we've been trying to figure out how to incorporate that data set because we couldn't actually track. That was the tricky thing. There was somebody who did follows, but we couldn't actually put collars on those ones.
Okay.
I believe. So we have the data and I would be happy to share it. I need to check with the rest of our team and make sure that's okay. But if you want to follow up by email, I would love to connect you with the team. And then we don't have papers out yet, but they're on that particular species. We've got papers that just came out on the Diker. We've got one that's going in for publication on the bats. And then there's going to be at least a couple papers on the interactions across these different taxa, including the gray-cheeked mangabees. So be on the lookout for that. I can point you to the Diker paper and another one that was just accepted. But yeah, send me if you want to drop your email, or I'll put mine in the chat and you can send a follow-up. I'd love to connect you with the right people. And Meg Crowfoot is a good person to know if you're interested in gray-cheeked mangabees.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. This was a lot of fun. Thank you again, Kendall, for allowing us to organize a workshop this week. I hope it's been a great week. So
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. That was amazing. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you so
Thank you.
much. Learned a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.
Yep.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
You too.